The day 3 black SUVs rolled up my gravel driveway. I was waist-deep in hay, fixing the back fence where a mule had kicked through it the night before. I wiped the sweat off my brow when the doors opened, and out stepped 3 suits with briefcases and smug expressions. Right behind them, in a powder-pink pantsuit and oversized sunglasses, came the shrill voice I'd been dreading all week. "Marshal Zeke, we need to talk." Now, that was Jeanette Bradford, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association and self-declared queen of the subdivision that sat a quarter-mile from my land. She was the type who used phrases like, "I'll escalate this," and "as per regulation," like it was her native tongue. I leaned on the fence post and gave her a long look. "I don't live in Willow Creek," I said. "This is my farm, has been for 15 years. You folks built your cookie-cutter boxes near me, not the other way around." Jeanette didn't even blink. She snapped her fingers, and one of the lawyers, some guy with slicked-back hair and zero eye contact, handed me a folder thick with papers. "You're within the border of what we've recently annexed. The HOA has voted to include this land under our jurisdiction. That means we need access to survey, inspect, and determine compliance." I laughed, not a chuckle, a full, belly-deep laugh that startled my goats. "You think you can vote to take my land? What is this, monopoly?" Jeanette's lips twitched. "If you refuse access, we'll pursue legal action. You're officially on notice." I flipped open the folder. It was full of made-up maps, HOA meeting notes I'd never been invited to, and some nonsense about shared perimeter authority. "No judge in this state will side with you," I told them, tossing the folder onto the hood of her SUV. "You're trespassing, that's your only legal standing." Jeanette stepped forward. "I'm giving you 24 hours to comply. After that, we come back with enforcement." I didn't say another word. I just walked into the barn, pulled out my phone, and called a friend of mine, Alina, a property rights attorney I'd helped out years ago when her horse got loose, and I tracked it for 2 days through the woods. She owed me. Big time. By sundown, I had 3 security cameras installed along the driveway, one by the barn and another hidden in the tree line. Alina had already emailed me state laws showing how HOA jurisdiction couldn't extend beyond subdivision boundaries, especially not onto independent, deeded farmland like mine. The next morning I was ready, but Jeanette didn't wait 24 hours. She came back with her lawyers. And this time she brought a drone. The drone buzzed like a giant wasp, low enough to rattle the old wind chime I'd hung from the sycamore tree decades back. It hovered over my pasture, dipping toward the chicken coop, and then sweeping wide across the paddock where my Mustang, Whiskey, kicked at the air in protest. I stood by the porch, arms crossed, watching Jeanette's latest stunt play out with the quiet resolve of someone who'd already laid the groundwork. Alina had filed an emergency injunction at dawn, and the sheriff's office had received the documentation less than an hour ago. All I had to do now was let the HOA dig their own hole. The black Escalade parked just outside my property line, tires crunching against gravel as Jeanette stepped out. This time, she wore heels completely unsuited for the terrain and a blazer so stiff it looked like it might creak when she moved. Behind her, the 2 attorneys from before flanked another man, this one holding a tablet and wearing a high-visibility vest. "Hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing vaguely at the drone. "We're just conducting a visual inspection. Preliminary mapping for zoning purposes." "Zoning doesn't apply out here," I said flatly. "You're not in city limits, you're not in county jurisdiction, and you sure as hell aren't in charge of airspace." The man with the tablet looked uncomfortable, but Jeanette didn't seem to register it. She pointed toward the barn. "We received anonymous complaints about unsafe livestock containment. That structure there," she said, "appears to be non-compliant with fire code." I stepped off the porch and walked right up to the edge of my property, stopping just short of the boundary line. "You're making this up as you go, Mr. Zeke," interrupted one of the lawyers. "The HOA has full rights to investigate claims of endangerment to neighboring properties, especially when—" I didn't let him finish. I have a temporary restraining order, I said, holding up a rolled document sealed in plastic. Signed by Judge Landry at 7:40 this morning. You step 1 foot onto this property again, you're in violation. Jeanette's lips parted, but she didn't speak. The third man looked over at her, then back at me. I wasn't made aware you're trespassing with surveillance equipment, I cut in. That drone's already been reported to the FAA and your client. She's about 5 minutes away from a visit from Deputy Morales. Sure enough, a tan cruiser turned onto the road just as I said it, lights off but unmistakable. Jeanette finally broke her silence. This is pure obstruction, she said, voice tight. We have authority to protect community interests. You have authority within Willow Creek. That's where it ends. This land is protected under agricultural exemption and isn't subject to your bylaws or your fantasies. Deputy Morales stepped out of his cruiser and walked over. He didn't say a word at first, just took the restraining order from my hand, read it, and then turned to the group. You were served this morning, he said to Jeanette, and you still showed up. That makes this a direct violation. The lawyer with the slick hair raised his hands. We were under the impression the order hadn't been filed yet. We didn't receive confirmation. Morales didn't blink. Doesn't matter, it's active. You're also operating an unregistered drone over private property. That's a separate issue. I suggest you pack it up. The man in the vest mumbled something about not wanting to get involved and started walking back to the SUV. The drone buzzed higher, then pivoted and zipped away, disappearing behind the tree line. Jeanette stood her ground. You don't understand what you're doing. This property affects the valuation of all adjacent lots. If he refuses basic oversight, it could. Deputy, I said calmly. Can you please inform Miss Bradford that continued attempts to access my land will result in criminal trespass charges? Morales nodded. You heard him. This isn't a civil discussion anymore. You're interfering with protected land. That's not negotiable. The lawyer tugged at Jeanette's sleeve. We should leave. She hesitated, then turned on her heel and climbed back into the Escalade. The moment the door shut, I exhaled. Morales handed me back the order. You did good getting ahead of this, he said. They're not the first HOA to try something like this, but they're the loudest I've seen in years. I nodded. They're just getting started. This wasn't about zoning or fences. They're trying to leverage control for financial gain. He tilted his head. You thinking embezzlement? Not yet, but Alina's digging through their quarterly reports. There's a lot of money unaccounted for, and they've been trying to expand jurisdiction without a single county filing. Morales raised an eyebrow. Let me know what she finds. If there's fraud, I'll run it up the ladder to the DA. Once the cruiser pulled away, I walked back to the barn where Whiskey was still pacing. I gave him a pat on the flank, then checked the footage from the tree-line camera. The drone had dipped low enough to snap clear shots of my property, a violation of both FAA and state privacy regulations. That was going straight to Alina. By dusk, she'd confirmed the drone was registered under a shell company that had ties to a Willow Creek board member. Not Jeanette. Her name didn't appear anywhere on the paperwork, but the treasurer, Paul Henley, had signed the drone license renewal last month. Alina thinks she's got enough to subpoena financial records, I told my neighbor Franklin as we leaned against the fence later that evening. They've got a slush fund for community development that's off the books. Franklin scratched at his beard. You reckon they're trying to grab land to inflate their budget? Exactly. More land, more dues. If they can claim my acreage, they can pad their numbers and pull cash for whatever pet project they're funding. He nodded slowly. They picked the wrong mule to kick. The next morning, a notice appeared on the Willow Creek Community Board website. Someone had leaked the footage from my camera. The drone's illegal flight path, the conversation with Morales, and a full scan of the restraining order I'd served. Residents were furious. Half of them had no idea their dues were going toward funding private surveillance operations. That evening, I got a voice message from one of the HOA's own board members, a woman named Carla who'd voted against the annexation plan. She sounded nervous but determined. "I didn't vote for this," she said. "Jeanette pushed the whole thing through with barely a quorum. They've been operating without transparency for months. If you're serious about stopping them, I'm in." I called her back before sunset. "Then let's burn their paper empire to the ground." By the time Carla pulled into my driveway in a dusty sedan that had clearly seen better years, the sun was dipping behind the ridge, painting the fields in a copper glow. She stepped out with a stack of folders in one hand and tension in her shoulders that hadn't eased since our call. Her eyes scanned the perimeter like someone expecting to be followed. "I parked 2 blocks down before circling back," she said immediately. "If Jeanette sees me here, I'll probably get booted from the board before morning." "You're not trespassing," I said, motioning her toward the porch, "and you're not the one under investigation." She set the folders down on the table and opened the top one. "These are copies of internal memos, all from the last 6 months. Meeting summaries, email printouts, and a few things I probably wasn't supposed to see. Paul's been directing money through a vendor account that doesn't actually do anything. Most of the board thinks it's a landscaping contractor. It's not. It's a P.O. box registered to a Shell LLC. There's no equipment, no employees, no tax filings, but they've been paid nearly $78,000 since February." I lifted one of the invoices. It had been backdated to the previous quarter and labeled Retention Management Services. Nothing about it made sense. "And you're sure this went through without a full board vote?" Carla nodded. "Jeanette told us it was an emergency vendor to handle a liability incident near the retention pond. But there's no report, no file, just this paper trail and a lot of closed-door meetings." I sifted through the stack, taking mental notes. "Why didn't you bring this to the county?" "Because we're not technically under county oversight. HOAs are self-governed unless they violate criminal statutes. And most members don't ask questions as long as the lawns stay trimmed and the pool opens on time." I tapped the edge of the invoice. "They're laundering dues," she nodded grimly. "And if they can annex more land, they justify raising assessments. More money, less scrutiny." I stood and walked to the edge of the porch, watching the wind ripple across the hay fields. "They tried to take this farm to inflate their numbers. That drone wasn't about compliance, it was about appraising." Carla's voice dropped. "Jeanette's been meeting with a developer, someone from out of state. She's pretending it's just for long-term planning, but Paul already approved escrow transfers for site review. They're trying to flip farmland into zoned lots. They don't even own the land. They think they can force it through with enough signatures and a few legal threats." I turned back to her. "You willing to testify to everything you just told me?" She hesitated, then said, "If it means stopping them, yes. But I want legal protection. You'll have it." I made the call to Alina that night, and by morning, she had a contact at the state attorney's office reviewing the financial documents. Carla's evidence, combined with a few drone flight records Alina had pulled from FAA logs, painted a clear picture. The HOA leadership was orchestrating a fraudulent land grab under the guise of expansion, funneling resident dues into a fake vendor account, and using intimidation tactics to silence dissent. 2 days later, an unmarked SUV pulled up outside Carla's home just after dawn. She called me in a panic, thinking Jeanette had sent someone to confront her. But it wasn't the HOA, it was a pair of investigators from the state's white-collar crimes division. They spent nearly 4 hours inside, collecting everything she'd documented. Meanwhile, back at the farm, I was finalizing a set of affidavits with Alina. She'd coordinated with a judge in the neighboring district, someone with no political ties to Willow Creek, and filed a formal motion to freeze the HOA's discretionary accounts pending investigation. It was approved in under 12 hours. At 6 the following morning, Deputy Morales returned to my property. This time he wasn't alone. 2 state troopers followed him and one carried a padded evidence case. Morales looked more tired than usual. "They issued the warrant just before midnight," he said. We're executing a search on HOA headquarters. That includes Paul's home office and Janet's property. You started a fire, Zeke. Good, I said. Now let's make sure it doesn't get put out with hush money. He handed me a copy of the warrant, then added, there's more. That drone footage you submitted, it caught something interesting. Not just your land, they were flying over other properties too. One neighbor's kid was out back in a bathing suit. That's a privacy violation that could go federal. I didn't say anything for a moment. They crossed a line, he added. They crossed 20, I muttered. By the time the sun was fully up, news vans were parked outside Willow Creek's clubhouse. Residents gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing as officers taped off the entrance. The treasurer, Paul Henley, was escorted out in handcuffs. Jeanette wasn't far behind, her hands cuffed behind her back, still wearing her signature pearl necklace and stiff blazer, though the effect had lost all its bite. Carla stood off to the side, arms folded and jaw set. When she saw me approach, she didn't greet me, just handed over a printed document. What's this? I asked. The board's emergency meeting log. Jeanette authorized a security initiative last month, $20,000 to install motion cameras on properties bordering the subdivision. Ones that didn't belong to HOA members. They were spying. Worse, she said. They were gathering footage to fabricate complaints. A few members got threatening letters about building violations that don't exist. One woman was told her fence encroached 5 feet into HOA space, even though she's lived there since the subdivision was built. I took the paper and tucked it into my jacket pocket. This is going to get ugly. It already is. By the end of the week, the state attorney's office had filed 12 counts of financial misconduct, 3 counts of wire fraud, and 2 of unlawful surveillance. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen. The clubhouse was shuttered. And a temporary receiver was assigned to manage the neighborhood's affairs while investigations continued. I didn't see Jeanette again until her arraignment. She kept her head down, her designer sunglasses traded for a county-issued jumpsuit. Paul looked worse, his lawyer kept whispering in his ear, but he just stared at the floor like he couldn't believe any of it was real. They both pled not guilty. Didn't matter. Elena was already preparing the civil suits for residents who'd been targeted. Carla had been appointed interim board president by unanimous vote, and as for me, I'd been contacted by a local journalist looking to run the full story. They wanted to feature the footage, the legal documents, even the restraining order that kicked the whole thing off. I told them they could have it all on one condition. I want the headline to read, "Farmer shuts down HOA takeover with one court order." The reporter blinked. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? I looked out across the pastures. The sun was just coming up, casting long shadows from the barn to the tree line beyond. Not dramatic, I said. Just accurate. The courthouse cafeteria was nearly empty when Carla slid into the booth across from me, her face pale but composed. A single foam cup of coffee steamed in her hands. I hadn't seen her since the arraignment, and I could tell the pressure had worn on her. Her blazer hung looser than before, and her eyes flicked toward the hallway like she expected someone to appear at any moment. They tried to contact me again, she said without preamble. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. Who? Not Jeanette, someone else, a man I've never seen before, left a typed note under my windshield. No signature, just a message. The board doesn't forget its friends or its enemies. I sat back and exhaled. They're not done. Not by a long shot. Carla set the coffee down. The financial audit turned up something worse. Elena called me yesterday. She's working with the forensic accountant now. They found transfers from the HOA's discretionary fund to a private escrow account tied to a property trust in Nevada. The trust owns 4 parcels along the northern border. They were planning to buy out those residents quietly, then file rezoning petitions under a fake developer name. Let me guess, I said. If they'd gotten those parcels, they'd have formed a corridor straight into my land. Carla nodded. And then they'd claim you were surrounded on 3 sides by HOA-controlled property. They were building a case for inevitable inclusion. It wouldn't hold up in court, but it could tie you up in litigation for years. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. Why Nevada? It's a quiet state for trusts. Easy to hide ownership, but it gets worse. The accountant found payments labeled compliance services that match the amount one of the parcel owners claims he was offered in cash off the books to vacate. I narrowed my eyes. That's bribery, and if they used HOA funds. They did. I stood abruptly and pulled out my phone. We need to meet Alina and the investigator. Now. 2 hours later, we were back in the regional task force office, in a windowless room with white tile floors and a faint hum from the overhead lights. A young agent with a shaved head and sleeves of tattoos spread out a series of financial statements across the table. Alina was already there, arms crossed, eyes on fire. "We're recommending a grand jury," she said. "The evidence is in." Paul Henley and Jeanette Bradford funneled over $200,000 into shell companies, used HOA funds to pay off potential sellers, and attempted to fabricate zoning pathways for private development. Conspiracy to commit fraud, financial coercion, and illegal use of member dues. The agent tapped a sheet with a pen. And that's not all. We've got whistleblower testimony from a former paralegal who worked at the law firm representing them. She says they knew the land grab was illegal. They told the board to create a perception of community consensus and push through annexation regardless. There are emails to prove it. Carla's hand trembled slightly as she turned over one of the documents. This is bigger than I thought. It's organized," Alina said. "And they've done it before." Another HOA in a different district had similar tactics, same law firm, same legal templates. "We're looking into whether this is a coordinated scheme across multiple neighborhoods." The agent added, "We've issued subpoenas to the firm. If they don't cooperate, we go federal." By the end of the week, more arrests followed. Not just Paul and Jeanette. 3 other board members were named in the indictment, along with 2 attorneys from the firm. The Nevada Trust was frozen, and the parcels were placed under independent review by the state land board. Every resident whose property had been targeted received certified letters offering legal protection and reimbursement through a restitution fund the state had expedited. I was back on my porch when Morales pulled up again, this time unaccompanied. He stepped out in his worn boots and leaned against the rail with a weariness that only came after a long, ugly case. "They're done," he said. "No bail for Paul or Jeanette. The judge called them a direct threat to community stability. You don't hear that often in fraud cases." I handed him a glass of iced tea. "What happens to the HOA? State-appointed receivers dismantling it. The subdivision will remain, but without an HOA. Residents voted to dissolve it by 93%. Carla's stepping down once the transition is finalized. She deserves a break. She does." We watched the sun slip behind the trees for a moment, then Morales spoke again. "There's something else. The drone operator, he finally talked. Turns out he was hired under false pretenses. They told him he was doing overhead land mapping for a park expansion. He had no idea it was private property. Is he in trouble? No, he's cooperating, gave us flight logs, receipts, even emails. That sealed the privacy charge. That and the footage he didn't delete, he kept backups by accident. Proved they were targeting households with kids. That's what tipped the DA into going for a full criminal racketeering charge. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. A few days later, I got an invitation in the mail, handwritten. No return address. It was for a neighborhood gathering not in Willow Creek, but at the community hall up the road. The residents wanted to thank me. I wasn't one for parties, but I showed up anyway in my oldest boots and a clean shirt. The place was packed. Families, retirees, young couples, all the folks who'd been under the HOA's thumb and hadn't even realized how deep it went. Carla stood near the front, looking like she'd finally exhaled for the first time in weeks. She raised a glass. To Zeke, who reminded us that fences don't just keep things out, they keep us strong inside. and to community the kind that doesn't need bylaws to do right. I didn't give a speech, didn't need to. I just tipped my hat and said, "Glad I could help." As I walked back to the truck that night, someone tapped my shoulder. A man in his 50s with a weathered face and calloused hands. He introduced himself as one of the parcel owners who'd been offered money to leave. "I didn't take it," he said, "didn't trust it, but I didn't know what to do." "You stood your ground," I said. "That's enough." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. Back at the farm, things settled. The goats were restless again, but that was normal. I spent the next week fixing the gate they'd bashed open and putting up new signage at the border. Not for trespassers, those signs were already there. These ones were different. They simply read, "Private land. Protected by the people who live here." The cameras stayed up, but I added one more pointed not at the road, but at the field beyond, where the fence met the tree line. Just in case anyone else ever got the idea that this place was up for grabs, they'd learn the same thing Jeanette did eventually.